David, the internet world is abuzz with information, questions, news, etc. about Hunter Biden's laptop and his business associates, but the mainstream news world has been very conspicuously ignoring the story. How are you this morning, David?
I'm very well, and I think we're going to find things about steganography that will shake the internet world, or at least I hope they do.
Yeah. It's a topic you and I have spoken about quite a bit in the past. And for people who are unfamiliar with the term, it basically just refers to encoding messages in plain sight. There are tons of examples of this. You and I have spoken about the Mendenhall's baby reference in the Washington Post, that they made a big deal out of kind of removing from their thing. Do you remember off the top of your head, David, some other examples of steganography that we've encountered?
I think, Jane Stanley's report from New York would be steganography because the thing that she says has collapsed is still standing.
Well,
right?
It could be steganography if she is sending a message. This is basically what we're going to talk about today is the BBC sending steganographic messages in a variety of ways? And David, I think they might be. I think an argument could be made that the BBC Broadcasting House itself has an encoded steganographic message. Obviously, people who, stand here at the entrance, they may not realize this. People in the know, you might not even notice this, but they've got this pretty pedophilia-centric sculpture in the front of their thing. That's sending a message, isn't it?
Yeah, and the one around the side with that, the Benedictine word obsculta, right? That's a less subtle message, but it means listen and obey. It was crafted in 1934, and basically the BBC, the world's largest broadcaster, is telling the public, which is 500 million weekly audience, listen and obey. Don't question, wear your masks, and stay 6 feet apart.
Yeah, and I mean, this is definitely a steganographic message because the word means listen and obey. The statue is right there on the side of the building. You and I saw that statue. It was right in front of our faces, but we didn't know about the obsculta message until somebody in the know told us about it. And I think it's important that people realize that this type of messaging is going on sort of all the time.
Well, and just across the road is the Langham Hotel, which probably received the first, now whether you'd say it was steganographic, I don't know how it was transmitted, telegraph concerning the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so anyone on the inside of the Langham Hotel, think the inner party. Remember the BBC, George Orwell? He described an inner party. The people who have access to these steganographic messages and their codes can get very wealthy, and they become insiders, I believe, characteristic by George Orwell's inner party, which is 2% of the population, which I think has got incredibly rich thanks to steganographic messages transmitted through the BBC. Over to you.
And that's just it, David. I don't know that Jane Stanley's message that the Solomon Brothers building has collapsed is in and of itself steganographic. The idea is the message is there even if we don't know it, even if George Orwell doesn't know it. This thing here says liberty means, what does it say? Having the freedom to, I can't even read it here.
Say what people do not want to hear or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Liberty means anything at all. It means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Now, that is incredible. So there's a message there that's clear, and that is George Orwell's message about liberty. But perhaps underneath that message, contained within that message, and we're not claiming to know how to decode these encoded steganographic messages, but today, David, when we continue our sponsor-exclusive portion of the show on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, we're going to delve into a lot of these different steganographic messages and explore at least what we think could be an approach to steganographic messaging. Don't really know how to decode the messages.
Well, some people do. And let me just do a little bit of history of the BBC when it first probably introduced a steganographic capability with a product called CFAX that was
Uh-huh.
introduced in 1970s. CFAX spelled CEEFAX, CFAX. And this was a text message that if you had the code, I think it was a 3-digit code, you could read the text messages, but of course you could presumably create a community which had a private code, 333, 666, or 999,
Uh,
where you would get the messages through the BBC, which is, but without doubt, the world's biggest broadcaster and propagandist, etc., etc. So, of course, if the BBC was transmitting messages that gave you an insight on event outcomes before they'd happened, you could take a position either in the stock market or gold or shares or insurance or whatever and get exceedingly wealthy, which would be a characteristic, I think, of the BBC's inner party. And the inner party term introduced by George Orwell, that was the first non-ideological party in the world, right? And that's very important because if you look at the November 3rd election, it's all about not ideologically based, Republican or Democrat or whatever. It's about whether Trump introduced this mask legislation or enforced it. And now, and I think this is I've been thinking a lot about the Biden laptop, and I'm wondering if from the BBC inner party's point of view, it really doesn't want a runaway situation. It wants a neck and neck situation as you go into November the 3rd, because a neck and neck situation is much easier to manipulate, right? If Trump or Biden got well ahead of the other and the election turned for the guy who's seen to be fall behind, he suddenly comes in front, there'd be a lot of suspicion about
right.
manipulation through the mainstream media. But by hammering Trump continuously for the reaction to COVID-19, which incidentally was introduced really digitally by the BBC with that Contagion documentary, right? That's a parallel narrative. Those were digital infections transferred from one cell to another that created a perception amongst the people who put the documentary on, and now I believe is excuse me, is feeding into the real world. Over to you.
Well, it's true, David. I think a lot of people kind of bolster their general knowledge in part by things. I mean, look, you learn things about science even from entertainment. Anybody who ever watched the show Breaking Bad, they talk about certain, chemistry things that perhaps you would learn something. And I think that, as Elmer Davis said, people are getting propagandized by entertainment. And as we have these programs, these infotainment programs where scientists participate in simulations, actors play a role in politics, news people appear in entertainment films like we showed with Elmer Davis and Wolf Blitzer, we start to blur the lines of what is entertainment, what is news, and what is information.
And so the BBC is a global master of parallel narratives. And that term,
Yes.
I hadn't heard, I think you were in the entertainment industry, I believe you'd heard, until the BBC noted that it was going to commission a documentary next year for the events of 9/11, right, describing the Twin Towers attack. It introduced the term parallel narrative because what it claims to be describing is the experiences of, let's say, a firefighter who got out of the building. What I believe, actually, it's disguising the reality of the events that led up to the Twin Towers collapsing. So the BBC, it's a very important year. In 1997/1998, a man called Alfred Hermida, now the professor of journalism at UBC, became or launched the online news desk for the BBC. And it appears that he adopted a technology from Serco called Trump with a set of interface devices that would allow him and the BBC to generate parallel narratives. Because you could inject, for example, there's that patent called the spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals that was patented by the BBC, right?
Well, let's talk about that for a second, David, because this is something we've spoken about quite a bit. And, some of the social engineers who try to move us off the mark want to have us believe that this thing is a teleprompter, but that cannot be, because you're not able to patent something that's already patented. It has to be novel. It has to be new. And this is talking about text to be spoken by a speaker, for example, a newsreader, and held in a store, is displayed on the display, which is seen by the speaker through a partially reflecting mirror mounted in front of a television camera. The text is scrolled up as the speaker speaks, this being archived automatically by a controller. The controller recognizes the spoken speech picked up by the microphone using speech recognition techniques and matches the spoken text with the stored text to be spoken. David, this is a mechanism for getting the newsreader to listen and obey, and if they don't comply, the text arguably could be changed, the broadcast could be cut. There's a lot of ways somebody could act on this this is almost like a two-way teleprompter that monitors what is being said.
And you see, you talk about the controller speeding up or speeding down depending on the rate at which the newsreader is speaking. So if you're naturally fast or slow, basically the text scrolling in front of you is synchronized to it. So you're always reading the next few words. Now, of course, that can be fed to you. I mean, the script kiddie, as I believe they're called, has no control over what is being read. So Jane Standley, I don't fault her. Her job was to read what was put in front of her. But there's something very important, because there is this last term in the title, the generation of television signals. And I think that's the key to steganography. That is to say, there is an artificial intelligence system that is parsing her words and sending a signal to people that might include the demolition crew that was planning to blow up building number 7. Right?
Well, so that's just it, David. This is a method for ensuring that the spoken text, the written text, is what is spoken. A teleprompter merely presents you with the script. It doesn't do anything to check if the person reading the script is listening and obeying. This says the speed at which the text is spoken is thus determined and used by positioning circuit to adjust the rate at which text scrolls up. If the speech recognition fails, the text continues to be changed at a rate dependent on the previous rate of change. So if the person doesn't say what's written there, the text can change, forcing them to listen and obey.
Yes. And they will be using, I can guarantee it, with 40 years experience in this area, they're using artificial intelligence algorithms to parse the spoken word by the speaker and drive the text to adjust what the speaker is saying, and at the same time synchronize injects into what I call a junket room strike team. That is to say, you can make the junket room strike team bring about the event that is predicted in Jane Standard's point before it actually happens.
Well, that's just it. This thing could be used to insert, they're telling us it's being used to provide the script and monitor the spoken words to make sure that the script is read exactly. David, this invention would be critical for putting out a steganographic message, because if the person needs to, let's say, tell the viewers about a certain number, for instance, there was an interview on Fox News the other day. Tucker Carlson interviewed this business associate of Hunter Biden named Tony Bobulinski, and he told Tucker Carlson that he had a Q-level security clearance. Now, that is potentially an important piece of information for him to get out. And if he did not say that, the spoken text device could say, wait a minute, this guy just said the letter R instead of the letter Q. And here we see Tony Bobulinski interview has QAnon supporters thinking he's the conspiracy leader. Perhaps that was what he wanted to do. I found it rather conspicuous that Tony Bobulinski would announce that to the public. Most people don't even know what that level of clearance does. Why didn't he just say, I was in the Navy on a nuclear submarine, so I have a high-level security clearance?
Well, exactly. So what's really interesting is who is monitoring the injection of the narratives that they want the public to believe. And I come back to the guy who founded, it was the founder editor of the BBC online news desk, Alfred Hermida, who I've been trying to get on your show. He hasn't responded. And again, this is the sort of dog that didn't bark issue, right? And it's very subtle because why hasn't he? Obviously, he's an expert. He's the founder editor of the BBC online news desk. So he would have been using this technology that I believe was patented by the BBC. I think from memory, it was on the 4th of August, 1998, which is significant because 3 days later is my birthday, and the attack on the US embassies in East Africa, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, which were apparently simultaneous. Now, the BBC has done a documentary on this, but it looks to me as though there was a steganographic signal or signals being sent through the BBC to the demolition crews that were deployed to Nairobi and Dar es Salaam to kill lots of Americans and local people. So it was a brutal thing. But the editor of the BBC online news desk, Alfred Hermida, must have witnessed the signals going, whether they're steganographic or actual. He must have witnessed the distribution of the real and the fake narratives as they were running through the BBC online news report, which would have, well, now it reaches an audience of 500 million people in 50 languages. So whatever you and I say, Jason, and whatever our listeners think, the audience, the global audience that is getting on the receiving end of this, what I would call propaganda, or this parallel narrative or fake real characters switching, the victims as a global listening community. Over to you.
Yeah. And I agree that Alfred Hermida would have been involved in this, but the insidious thing about this type of steganographic messaging is that he might not even know. Jane Stanley might not even know. It's that encoded. And, you know, the thing I want to focus on with regard to the BBC and steganographic messaging, it's so complicated. I think a lot of people think about stuff in real binary terms, David, and this is a multi-dimensional, multi-level type of deception. The BBC has been very, very focused. And again, I want to make sure people understand, I'm not saying Tony Bobulinski mentioning this means anything about the validity of the movement surrounding that. I just found it extremely conspicuous that he would mention that. Certainly Tucker Carlson had to know that that would set off alarm bells. I mean, we're fearful to even mention the letter because it might get our YouTube channel banned. I've been kicked off of Facebook in the past 2 weeks, and the BBC has been very much more concerned in informing people about Facebook and other things banning this movement that they're trying to position as a dangerous conspiracy theory. And they haven't been very focused on talking about Hunter Biden's laptop, evidence brought forward by Navy veteran Tony Bobulinski, et cetera. It's quite curious, David.
Well, there are three legs to what I call a tri-cyber attack. And we've talked about parallel narratives. And I think that technology that was introduced by the BBC in 1997, 1998, basically took that old CFAX capability, which was introduced in the 1970s, into the online era. That is to say, you could use the technology at the time to inject parallel narratives. But there's also another leg to this attack, and that is the compromised node. And again, that's a term that I hadn't heard of until I saw that PhD thesis or news about Cameron Ortis, the guy who did a PhD up at UBC called Bowing to Quirinus, which is an authority figure in the Roman pantheon, and something like the use of compromised nodes by East Asia crime groups.
But let me pause you on that, David. I do want to come back to that, but this CFAX, it's amazing. See, I love it when you and I get on the show and you drop things very matter-of-factly that you've never mentioned to me before, and we were struggling a bit last night to bring these ideas together. This might be one of the most important things that we've never spoken about before, this CFAX thing. This is very closely tied to SMS, the simple messaging system that most people refer to as texting. right? Isn't this the precursor to texting?
Yes.
Now, here's something interesting, David. I'm not exactly sure how, but Twitter is somehow based on SMS. And it's interesting because Twitter is at the center of this controversy having to do with Hunter Biden's laptop, the New York Post story that's been suppressed by Twitter and the BBC, how to use your SMS created account on the web when you sign up for Twitter from your phone. See, I don't know when this document is from, but there's something people might know in our viewing audience what the origin of Twitter has to do with SMS. Like originally you could only use 140 characters or something. So the fact that those are linked, is there some secret link between the BBC and Twitter? Because Twitter also wants people to listen and obey. They are not letting go of this notion that the information on Hunter Biden's laptop has been suppressed from Twitter because of their rules against publishing hacked material. However, they don't address directly the fact that they have no evidence that the material was hacked.
Well, if you go back to CFAX, and that was introduced in 1974, and the BBC became the first broadcaster to use a coded text messaging to its audience, right? So if you come back to the philosophy of Trump, where you can clip in different systems and make them equally or easily usable, then I would imagine CFAX plugs into Twitter. CFAX plugs into the online facility for parallel narratives, and that spoken text display apparatus could feed Twitter or SMS. So they're all connected, where short steganographic messages are shared between insider groups, and another level of messaging is spread with the general public. So the general public does not know what is being communicated amongst insiders, or let's call it the BBC's inner party, the elite, the 2%. Over to you.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out what the relationship is with SMS and Twitter. But let's read a bit from this CFAX, because this is so fascinating to me. This CFAX thing, it's designed to look like a very 70s kind of almost video game. And it tells us here that it's a pun on facts. So again, just as Jack Dorsey sits in front of the Senate, he's essentially giving us a steganographic message. The steganographic encoded message in plain sight is that Hunter Biden's laptop was hacked. And he doesn't come out and say that. He encodes it in his direct message, which is, we blocked it because it violates our rules on sharing hacked material. Someone hearing that would infer that it's not being shared because it's hacked. But when I think Ted Cruz asked directly, what evidence do you have that the laptop information has been hacked? He says none. So he's encoded that message in another message, hasn't he?
Well, and so that comes back to my theory, and I'm still developing it on the fly, is that the BBC does not want Biden to run away from Trump in the election, or the reverse, because they can control the outcome much more effectively if it's a neck and neck job. That is to say, as the news comes in, let's say I believe there are two states in the Republic which have been captured by crime groups, and that's Illinois and California. And I think there are two provinces in Canada that have been captured, and that's British Columbia and Quebec. So those four states, if you will, and Chicago and San Francisco and Vancouver and Montreal represent the core, I believe, of a compromised community or compromised city or compromised state where nothing happens unless an online judicial elite allows it to happen. So I'm not diverting, at least I don't believe I am. So when you have these elections, right, you've got the public that is being whipsawed between two people that would appear on the surface to be very different, but I'm wondering if the two of them have the same agenda injected into them. Over to you.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore further, and I think we've got to get pretty deep to do it. So I think I might have something here, David. First of all, let's review this Wikipedia entry for CFAX, the thing that BBC created in the 1960s or the 1970s to help people see facts through a teletext information service It was the forerunner to the current BBC Red Button service. Red Button for the Red Team. CFAX was started by the BBC in 1974 and ended after 38 years of broadcasting at 2332. That's interesting, isn't it? So again, this could be a steganographic message in and of itself, but it was to receive a desired page of text on a CFAX-capable receiver, the user would enter a 3-digit code on the device. So we're already talking about encoded messages going back and forth. Once coded in, this page would update on the user's screen as and when appropriate. So it's a method of sending coded text messages. Now, David, I do believe I've found what I've been thinking of with regard to Twitter. This is a story from the History Channel talking about how Twitter was created. Basically, Twitter launches 2006, July 15th, right? So it's just 4 years before the president of television gets involved. But they're talking about how after Williams asked a team of 14 employees to brainstorm their best ideas for the flailing startup, one of the company's engineers, Jack Dorsey, came up with the concept of a service allowing users to share personal status updates via SMS to groups of people. By March 2006, they had a working prototype and the name Twitter, inspired in part by bird sounds. So clearly Twitter was based on using SMS. SMS is based on CFAX. The question is, has Jack Dorsey ever had any inspiration from, collaboration with, employment at, people, anything to do with BBC? What do you think of that, David?
Well, it comes back to the BBC as the world's biggest broadcaster, right? It's famous for, going back to World War II, the generation of propaganda, the double-cross operations with RCA. And remember, RCA GB 1929 became Serco. So BBC and Serco are working together in the introduction of that Trump technology in 1998 that allows you to generate parallel narratives. And the parallel narratives, I believe one side of the parallel narrative, that is the real parallel narrative that describes real events, is distributed amongst insiders. So they know when the building's going to come down, or they know when the plan is for the building to come down. So
well, they also know if the laptop is real and authentic or hacked, and what they want the public to know may differ from what they know.
And you remember that there's that bit of news about Tracy McVicker, the CAI private equity.
Yes.
She was in Manhattan on 9/11 to collect a computer from the World Trade Center. Now, what was on that computer? I believe what was on that computer was a back door through Trump into the events at Ground Zero.
Wow. I wonder if there's something on Hunter Biden's computer that's even more important than, see, that's just it. What's contained in these images and messages, it's also confusing, David, but I think we're onto something with these coded messages and what's presented versus what is not presented. I feel like we're...
And, if I may say so, the compromised node that I think we have to introduce. Where is the compromised node in New York since the 1990s? Well, isn't it Ghislaine Maxwell, right? Jeffrey Epstein, and their entourage that swan off on those Boeings, right, to the island and abuse or attack young girls or young boys, for all I know. So everyone who's got an image in that network, and maybe they're up on the cloud, right, is potentially a target for blackmail. So before we discuss the morality of what sexual activities these people are getting up to, we have to ask, if they're people of influence, have they been caught in a trap which allows them to be extorted or blackmailed? And the answer is that entire group or community around Epstein, yeah, absolutely. And then up in BC, right, at UBC alumni, you have Justin Trudeau, now the Prime Minister of Canada, and his roommate, Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, who was arrested and convicted and jailed for directing an international pedophile ring. And I guess you've got the equivalent in Chicago and in San Francisco. These people, I make no judgment of their sexual activities. What I do say, from the point of view of the survival of the republic, if you have leaders who willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwillingly, have compromised themselves, they can be adjusted and signaled steganographically, like, we want you to say this, we don't want you to say that, right?
Right.
And they are going to listen and they're going to obey. Over to you.
Right. Well, and again, this steganographic messaging, it transcends so many different mediums, David, because, you probably, I know you recall, but our viewers may recall when you and I did a special, I guess last year or 2 years ago in Vancouver, we visited 425 Carroll Street, and without hesitation, a guy who very clearly lived on the streets there, he told us that this, which, to the casual observer, this just appears to be a First Nations mural painted on the building, but he told us, David, it was a warning. So it is itself a steganographic message, isn't it?
Yes, listen and obey. So let's reverse engineer the events in Vancouver. At 425 Carroll Street, there's an operation called Starnet Communications that was raided on August the 20th, 1999, by law enforcement officers numbering between 100 and 150. It's a little unclear. And they were accused, Starnet was accused of producing hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming opportunities in 60 countries. So everyone in that activity was compromised, right? That is to say, whether or not the individual had abused a child, if they were on film or part of an operation that had abused children, possibly killed them, right? You got an extraordinary facility now for building a global network in 60 countries of compromised nodes. And every one of the consumers of those nodes is potentially, maybe the prime minister of country A or the president of country B, is potentially now vulnerable to online manipulation through steganographic messages. That is to say, you send the messages, keep your mouth shut on this incident, like the Christchurch attack in the mosque. Over to you.
How about the fact that Justin Trudeau himself may have a steganographic message encoded right on his left arm right here? David, Luke Slytalker, who is a regular viewer and has been on the show before, he's somewhat of an expert in decoding steganographic messages. He's mostly focused on steganographic messages that are digitally encoded within digital files, but he raises an excellent point. The name Twitter comes from the sound of birds tweeting. Luke tells us that bird sounds are used by native people as a means of covert communications. That's interesting.
Oh, totally. And obviously, there's a variety of ways of burying a message steganographically. It might be a number, 333. For example, what always struck me is the precision. And I think you and I discussed this last night, that very often a way of terrifying the public is to be extremely precise. So, for example, if the public or the people meeting on the 47th floor of the North Tower were told, you're going to have a plane or something that looks like a plane hitting the building at 8:46:46, and it does it, that's pretty scary.
Right.
If you're in that building, go ahead.
Well, let's focus on that for a second, because it's not just a matter of precision, it's a matter of threats or incidents that display unusual precision. In other words, like you're saying, well, let's go back to our friend Tony Bobulinski, because the other extremely conspicuous thing about the interview, which really was mostly to do with his business dealings with Hunter Biden, he made a point of telling us that his sister-in-law had died at 6:38 a.m. And I believe he repeated that, 6:38. So that's very precise, because most people would just say, well, my sister-in-law died around, early in the morning, 6, 7 a.m., something like that. That's, I think, how most people would convey it, unless they're talking about the strange death of the sister-in-law and how it occurred at exactly this moment. It was such a peripheral event to the main story. For him to use that level of precision seemed very conspicuous. And, David, 6 + 3 is 9. plus 8 is 17. It seems like another reference to this 17th letter of the alphabet. I am not giving any credence to the anonymous movement that is being villainized in the mainstream press. I'm just saying, Tucker Carlson, people at Fox News, Tony Bobulinski, they had to know that that was going to send a signal to someone.
Well, and you take a look at the BBC and the death of George Floyd, within a day or 2 days, I would say, the BBC online had spread that message that he was killed because Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And I think, was the first to pick up. Well, isn't that interesting? Because 8:46, I believe, was the time of impact of the weapons platform on the north face of the North Tower. So the BBC makes that statement, right? 8:46. But now there's an argument. And I think this is consistent with the idea, well, if the public or the insiders are told George Floyd will die before he actually dies, after Derek Chauvin, the white cop, kneels on his neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, maybe Derek Chauvin was told or ordered or threatened, we want you to kneel on this guy's neck for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. Doesn't matter whether he's squirming or shouting or whatever, because apparently the crowd around Derek Chauvin is saying, for heaven's sake, the guy is not breathing, or turn him on his side. Derek Chauvin ignores it. So maybe Derek Chauvin is being instructed or ordered, or has been instructed or ordered to kneel on this, because it's an odd. Why does he have to stay on his neck? Perhaps because he's delivering a message.
But not only that, as you brought up, there's a dispute as to the amount of time. It came out, I think, where was that article, David, that they said it was 9 minutes and 50 seconds. So that would mean this 8
You sent it to me in Skype.
Yes, let me get that.
And if I can just say, so I believe when, a bit like Jane Stanley saying the building has collapsed, or this guy died in 8:46, people are being told in advance, perhaps steganographically, that they plan for this guy to die in 8:46. So as an insider community, we're the insiders. We know the stuff that the public doesn't. But then it hits the media, and 2 days later, the BBC, in 50 languages, including Pidgin, has alerted an audience of 500 million people around the world that some white racist cop killed or murdered a black guy, Black Lives Matter, in 8:46. So that became a huge story with the time itself. What does it matter whether it's 8:46 or 8:40 unless you've got some money on it?
Wow. Well, the thing is, it matters in that it could have been a signal to start the rioting or who knows what. I mean, again, we're not claiming to have the ability to decode these messages. We're just looking at them and saying, this seems remarkably weird that, Wikipedia would have us believe that 8 minutes, 46 seconds is a symbol of police brutality. That's pretty specific, associated with the killing of George Floyd. So somebody decided that that was the way that was going to go. And now it's a symbol of police brutality. It's not merely a time. They don't say right there that 8:46 is the time of day that a plane hit the South Tower or the North Tower of the World Trade Center. They had a plan for what 8:46 was intended to be. And I'm trying to find the article where the BBC, helped solidify in people's minds. Interesting to note, David, that the New York Post, same periodical that published this Hunter Biden information, they are the ones who told us last week that new court papers reveal that George Floyd was pinned down longer than reported. So perhaps the actual time that he was pinned down didn't matter. It was just the message that 8:46, perhaps that means go.
I think you've nailed it. And I was telling you last night that particularly at Ground Zero, had the second plane in the New York that collided with the south face of the South Tower left on time, it would have hit exactly the same time as the north face of the North Tower. Now think of the dynamic impact on America. You're talking about shock and awe, willing suspension of disbelief. New Yorkers wouldn't have been able to come to terms with that. Now, in Washington, for example, that fourth plane that crashed in the field outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was 41 minutes late. If you buck out that and imagine steganographic signals that are actually going to the plane's computer to guide it into target, if you buck out the 41 minutes late, it would have hit the Capitol building at the same time, possibly the same second, as the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. And I think there was a joint meeting of the House. They would have all been eliminated. The Republic would be over. Unless you can imagine some scenario. And Dennis Hastert, I think a highly compromised Speaker of the House, was on a helicopter flying off to Chicago, where the Boeing headquarters had moved to. And ultimately, Hastert would go to jail, wouldn't he? Because he didn't reveal that he was being blackmailed, right?
Well, he was the Speaker of the House, right? And,
yes.
Right before Nancy Pelosi. And he went to jail for, I think, raping little boys or something, but not for that long. Let's see what it says about him being in jail. In 2003, he publicly called for legislation to put repeat child molesters into jail for the rest of their lives. He resigned. He went to jail for being a child rapist. The other thing that's interesting is that during the town hall meeting with Donald Trump and Savannah Guthrie, she asked him about the movement surrounding the 17th letter of the alphabet, and she said that it concerned people online who had a conspiracy theory that Democrats were satanic pedophiles. And she mocked that, but Dennis Hastert he was arrested. So here we go. Here's USA Today. Actually, what does the BBC say about Dennis Hastert being arrested? Dennis Hastert, there we go. Let's see what the BBC says here. Ex-House Speaker sentenced to 15 months in jail. I mean, that is no time at all for ruining the life of some children. It says that he mistreated students. But I think it was actually having sex with young boys, wasn't it?
I think so. And again, this is a classic example of a compromised node where Dennis Hastert might have been given a code, get the hell out of the Capitol building, because, well, he wouldn't need to explain it. It's a bit like Howard Lutnick, the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald, where 658 people died in the top of the North Tower. He's out of the office when the planes hit. And everyone in that building, or at least Cantor Fitzgerald, they died, including his brother. So isn't this a classic example of an inner party of elites being given these steganographic signals to take action where they survive, and their colleagues and fellow human beings, they basically die?
I mean, I think it's also very bizarre that we would have the mainstream news mocking this notion that there are satanic pedophiles. I mean, I don't know if we've seen direct evidence that Jimmy Savile was satanic, but he's one of the most prolific pedophiles. He engaged in necrophilia. That certainly seems pretty evil, and if it's not satanic, it's certainly not a far cry from it. So it's strange to me, David, that somebody on the news would mock this notion as, she was ridiculing it basically, when it's known that these people are engaging in this type of activity. Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Nexium guy, what's his name, David, Keith Renier. There's so many examples of this sort of thing happening. I just don't understand how a serious journalist could mock it as ridiculous, even if there are inaccuracies in the interpretations. It's certainly close to something, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this comes back to the parallel narrative, because what they do, for me, it's irrelevant whether it's satanic, but they'll plant that in the public mind.
Right.
And then there's this belief that most people don't believe there are such things. I think most people believe there are pedophiles, but very few people believe there are satanic pedophiles, or would recognize when they saw it, because that's a separate issue. So by planting the word satanic, they can then demonize the people who accuse, let's say, someone of being a satanic pedophile, when in fact all we need to know is, are they pedophiles? So with that raid of 150 people on Starnet Communications, that means 150 people, I believe, had to have been compromised because they took away evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries, and it went somewhere. I believe some of it may have gone to the Treasury building in New York, building number 6, because that's the center for the US Customs House, which was part of the raid.
And did you know that Twitter yesterday blocked the director of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol? He obviously wasn't listening and obeying. And David, it's coming up in our chat right now that people are pointing out there may even be a steganographic message encoded in every single appearance of Joe Biden. He's instructing people to text United to 30330. People point out that when you divide that by 2020, it comes out to 666, but it's also got the 333 there. These occurrences of the number 33, you and I have noticed in so many places, it just seems remarkably coincidental. So I think these steganographic messages are kind of everywhere. We don't really know what they mean, but that tattoo on Justin Trudeau, it reminds me of some attention that people have been bringing to tattoos that Hunter Biden has. It's certainly a way to mark a person and encode a message on them. If you meet someone who has a particular tattoo, I know the Yakuza use certain type of tattoos to identify themselves. If you're not a Yakuza and you see somebody with a tattoo, you might just think, hey, that's a fancy dragon tattoo. But if you are a Yakuza, you might know something about this person's status, their family, their history by looking at the tattoo.
Right. Well, let's take a poster board for the tattooed body, Angelina Jolie, right? Because let's say, think about that. I mean, and there are tattoos on her body that are fascinating from a point of view, particularly in where they go and what they do. Now, let's back up. The BBC, in its wisdom, has created a My World documentary where Angelina Jolie is the executive producer, right? And she is tasked with teaching children how to recognize fake news. Now, isn't that extraordinary? If
Maybe
you
she
go
should
around
teach
the
them how
front,
to recognize steganographic messages. Look at this. She's almost got a decoder on her.
Right. Now turn around the front and go further down the body, you'll see something equally. There's a bit of dog Latin, I think, called qui me nutruit, me detruit, which means he who nourishes me destroys me. Yeah, that's it. I mean, basically, you can speculate about where that cross is going. Now, this woman is a walking model or poster board for steganographic messages. And she's got a key position as executive producer of My World for the BBC, funded or partly funded by Bill Gates in relation to, for example, the education of children on how to recognize fake news as regards to COVID-19. So basically, they've got our collective minds, well, the average person, I think, is completely bewildered by what is the truth and what is the fake as regards to the spread of the virus. And I would just come back to the BBC produced this Contagion documentary where the virus was spread digitally, or let me put it this way, steganographically. Isn't Contagion, ! A classic example of steganographic messages to tell the public at large, this is how COVID-19 is being spread, when in fact that documentary is about a digital virus on a mobile, jumping from one mobile to another if you're less than 6 feet apart and you spend more than a minute in the neighborhood or proximity of the other party about to be infected. Over to you.
Well, and it's basically kind of, sending a message to people with that documentary, getting everybody sort of subconsciously prepared for this type of infection. See, I mean, and the other thing about these messages on Angelina Jolie is that they're really only presented to you when she wants them to be. She can wear a suit of clothes like this that essentially hides all that messaging. It's interesting, David, there were some questions about these tattoos that Hunter Biden had. I don't know if we can find those there, but I wonder, certainly tattooing somebody is pretty permanent. Here it is. So Hunter Biden is displaying his back tattoos for people, and people have said they look like the Finger Lakes, I think. Here it is. It does look pretty close. And I mean, that's an ugly tattoo. And although he's a crackhead, he has a ton of money. You think he could go to whatever tattoo artist he wants, could tattoo anything on there. Why would he put a tattoo like this?
To me, that looks like a claw mark.
Yeah.
Right. But let me just back up because we're getting out of time. So I believe that the party who has witnessed the use or abuse of steganography in the online news is this gentleman, Alfred Hermida. So I'd like, or think I would like, the public to consider this gentleman as a possibility, witting or unwitting, or willing or unwilling. He was at the introduction of the steganography or potential steganography into the BBC online news service that now reaches an audience, a weekly audience of 500 million people. Now I look at the people listening to our show, bless them, and I'm saying, how can you compete? Well, you can't compete with an audience, a weekly audience of 500 million people that can be injected or infected with fake news on a dime. That is to say, as Derek Chauvin is kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, the 8:46 steganographic signal is being injected into the global news such that at the end of the day or the end of that week, the BBC has got people are carrying placards, right? 8:46, Black Lives Matter. So how did that symbol or that number get injected into the global consciousness? Well, it did so through the BBC. Over to you.
And now we can't find it, so they've spoliated that evidence. They've scrubbed it. As a matter of fact, David, just yesterday I entered a document in one of the numerous lawsuits against me, and I spoke about exactly that, doing these types of provocative things and then spoliating the evidence, because it makes it much more difficult to convince people that that is what's going on if the evidence is removed. All these people who think that, whatever is a conspiracy theory are very convinced of that. And if you say, oh no, I have evidence, look, the BBC did something, and you go there and it's gone. Or if you say, hey, we have evidence, it says Mendenhall's baby in the Washington Post, and then you go there and it's gone. They've spoliated the evidence. It seems to be a regular practice of people who engage in steganographic messaging. These are all methods of obfuscating the truth.
Let me just, because again, we're running out of time. Could you just put up the definition of the inner party in George Orwell's 1984, right? I think you can find it in Wikipedia or something, because I think it's this is really interesting. Maybe we could, well, let me read that out. The inner party is the ruling class, and it communicates Big Brother's message to the lower classes. The outer party members hold positions of trust, but they are not decision makers in the government. There are far more proles, short for proletariats, than any other class. Now, the inner party is non-ideological. It's about power over. And if you look at the masks, the 6-foot distancing, never in the history of the world has a non-ideological form of social behavior been enforced on the public at large, not just American, but in, the North Korea, for all I know, and so on. So they've actually managed to introduce, I think, George Orwell's inner party concepts, which are non-ideological. That is to say, they don't care, I believe, whether Trump wins or Biden wins, but they want to maintain this clamp on the global society where the public accepts how close they can stand to their child. I mean, it's extraordinary, the degree of social control or social networking or social engineering that they've introduced and the average person accepts. Over to you.
Well, and David, just right here in our comments, somebody brought up the question, what does 4586 mean? But I think they meant, what does 8645 mean? Gretchen Whitmer, the Democrat governor of Michigan, who's been a real problem for people there, she appeared on, some stupid show with Chuck Todd or some mainstream person on NBC with a thing that said 8645, and that was an anti-Trump message using restaurant industry slang. And it says, oh snap, something went wrong. So it's not showing the image that was shown when I searched for this. But what happened was the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, had this tiny little, it seems to be covered here. There it is. So she's got this little tiny thing here that says 8645. Well, obviously Donald Trump is the 45th president, so he's sometimes referred to simply as 45, and to 86 something is to get rid of it. So, this is an appearance on NBC News. Gretchen Whitmer, this is her office or her home or some set where obviously people would have spent a lot of time and attention checking out what she's got in her background, a license plate that says respect. In my experience, David, set decorators, art department people, they fret over how each leaf on this plant looks. They would not allow something like this to be there if they didn't understand what it was. So this is yet another example of a steganographic message to someone, and it's been noticed by a lot of people because here's an article about it, talking right about it.
Yeah, and I get the impression there is a code book for what each of these means. So if it's restaurant slang means perhaps get rid of this guy or whatever, he's a threat. So they have a code book of numbered, probably digital. They don't put it in writing. And the BBC has that code book, and the inner party, not working for the BBC, but benefiting from the BBC and becoming perhaps billionaires in the process, they can communicate amongst themselves with these 3 or 4 letter codes. And that's a signal, right, to go and kill someone or blow up a building or put on a show with the fake narrative, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a shorthand, I suggest, for the inner party associated with the BBC. Over to you.
Our very astute viewers point out that 846 is actually encoded in 8645.
Right. You mean it's implicit in the 4-digit number?
Well, it's there. I mean, 846 being the time that the plane hit the North Tower and the amount of time. Here is an 846. It's jumbled up, but it's undeniably there.
And then maybe 5 eyes.
It's just, again, David, without having the decoder, if you look at an encrypted message, it looks like a jumble of nonsense. But if you have the decoder, it becomes a coherent message. So again, we're just pointing out that these messages appear to be there, in some cases very conspicuously. What they mean, however, remains a mystery. And if you were to go into court, let's say, and try to present an argument that this was happening from the standpoint, we can say whatever, we can speculate about things here and people are free to consider those things or reject those things or say this is fanciful nonsense or incorrect statements or whatever. But the point is, wait a minute. Oh, David, I almost lost my head. We've got to transition over to our sponsor exclusive show. We have only 2 minutes for people to join us on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, or subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. But I've been running my mouth, so we better stop this broadcast and head over there. We'll carry on immediately, David. Thanks everybody for watching.
Okay, thank you, Jason.